Could you please state your names for the record today? We'll start down on my left with you, Mr Sparrow.
Yep, Andrew Sparrow, Executive Manager of Air Navigation, Transformation and Risk at CASA.
Great.
Afternoon, Senators. Andreas Marchillo. I'm the Acting CEO and Director of Aviation Safety for CASA.
Sarah Natty, Assistant Secretary of Airports Branch at the Department.
Great.
Stephanie Werner, First Assistant Secretary, Domestic Aviation and Reform at the Department.
Marisa Purvis-Smith, Deputy Secretary, Transport Group at the Department.
Chair, Rob Sharp, Interim CEO of Air Services Australia.
Great.
And Pete Curran, Deputy CEO of Air Services Australia.
Okay. That's everybody. Thank you very much. And just to explain things that I'm sure you've seen, we have decided to try and segment this into broad geographical areas just to manage the flow of things. But we'll make sure we have time for everything, and I think we have plenty of time, so thanks for making yourself available. We've got your submissions, of course. Would you like to make, or anyone like to make, an opening statement as well?
Senator, I won't read it. But,
no, go for it, Mr Sharp.
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, I've only been in Air Services for just under 2 months, but I do come with 20 plus years of aviation experience, keen to participate in this hearing. As an interim CEO, I have been focused on community consultation. I live in Brisbane. I've actually attended already some of the consultations locally, and I've reached out to some of the community associations to meet with them, and those meetings have been organised. We do acknowledge, as an organisation, that our processes haven't always been perfect, but I am seeing quite a bit of improvement, and certainly, from my perspective, reaffirm that we'll continue to improve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Senator, I think you've got my statement. I won't read it out.
Okay, no problems at all. Well, thank you very much. I might just quickly kick off. As we've outlined, we're sort of starting with the broader Brisbane issues. I might, before we get to the consultation aspects, I suppose it's what struck me is that at our Brisbane hearings there were a number of complaints that certain things that perhaps should have been done in terms of flight path design, use of continuous descent operations, there's continuing issues obviously around the use of, or the amount of use of SODROPs, just haven't been done. And I think it's fair for me to say that a lot of the finger was pointed at Air Services Australia for those things not being done from almost all groups. Mr Sharp, I'd probably just invite you at first to respond maybe to some of those claims that were made in Brisbane, and if there is some truth to them, what's being done to finalise things as soon as possible.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. What I would say is when you look at the extended time frame of the Brisbane development, I can remember back in 2006, 2007 when the EIS was first being looked at, and you're talking well over decades to get to a point where flight paths were looked at. Throw COVID in, you got a lot of change through a very extended period. And the consultation processes varied at those various points as you went through. So I think the lesson for us as an organisation is that we do need to look at, in fact it's for the whole airline sector, how do you actually manage a consultation process that covers multiple decades effectively. And I think there's some good thinking that's gone into that and some good lessons, and we'll certainly look to apply those, for example, in Melbourne with the new runway down there. Having said that, I think consultation in the early days was probably not to the level of what you see happening today. So the noise action plan that came out of the post-implementation review is a good example where that has lifted. Certainly there's some enhancements that I'm seeing in terms of how the community is being consulted. But I would say consultation doesn't necessarily mean change on the ground. And I think there's some aspects of the community where they want to provide the complaint, but they also want the action changed. And the big challenge for Air Services is how do you actually balance all the competing demands, and I think that issue will continue. But it is about dialogue, two-way dialogue, and being very open and transparent, and that's something that we will continue to focus on.
Well, I agree very much with your comment that people want to see action on the ground. That's very much the feedback I've received. So just coming back to my question, I mean, on some of those specific things, take continuous descent operations. When can we see that implemented at Brisbane Airport?
Senator, I'll just pass over to Mr Curran to talk specifically to the timeline.
Thank you, Senator. We've been the Noise Action Plan for Brisbane contains a range of recommendations. I think you're familiar with it broadly. One of which is the implementation of continuous descent operations. Our pathway to deploying continuous descent operations is through a trial that we've initiated in Melbourne. That trial's been underway for some months now, and as we understand lessons learned from that, we'll look to take those lessons and deploy them at other airports and of course Brisbane. So I'm loath to commit to a time frame on CDO on continuous descent operations at the moment because we've got lessons to take out of Melbourne yet. It is quite a complex activity to deploy. It requires some potentially technology changes on our side, as well as changes in the way that we manage airline operations into a high density environment like Melbourne or Brisbane or Sydney. So we're taking lessons out of Melbourne, and we'll take next steps from there. We intend to conclude that trial later this year.
Okay, and so the trial will be done by the end of this year, but you're not sure when it will be rolled out?
Simply because we need to take the lessons out of it and understand how we would then deploy that to other locations. It's also a trial that's managing some of the upper airspace as well. So there's some complexity for us to work through, and then to take that to other locations requires bespoke design for Brisbane or any other airport.
Right. Okay, another big complaint from people was that they were promised that there would be more overwater operations, or sod drops, whatever you want to call them, but with the parallel runway being built, and on the data we received at least, that's really not happened, or not in a material way. Is there an update there about potentially expanding the use of overwater operations from Brisbane?
Yes, look, sod props gets a lot of airtime and conversation. It's not nirvana to solve all the problems, however, it is a piece of the puzzle. Sod props is in operation at the moment, but it probably sits at around 2% of the overall traffic. The Noise Action Plan and the Minister's recent direction spotlights the fact that come November there are changes that we're implementing, and we would expect to see that 2% increase to around the 5% mark. So we are looking at the work that's been coming out of the post-implementation review starting to be implemented. But if you want more detail, Senator, I'm happy to pass to Mr Curran again.
Okay, so what are the November changes? What's happening?
Senator, thank you. So as Mr Sharp says, from November through the calendar year 2025, we're expecting to deliver around about double what we were able to do in 2023 on a calendar year basis. So that's come about through a range of internal procedural changes, but also because in November 26 this year, we're changing some of the flight paths over water that will unlock some of the constraints that we have with regard to using sod props. That sod props mode is unquestionably the best community mode that we can deploy. Every flight that undertakes sod props is subject to sod props overflies between, depending on the alternative mode, between 300 and 500,000 fewer members of the community in Brisbane. So it's an excellent mode in terms of community outcomes. Its challenge is that we cannot do high demand periods of time. So peak period, Monday to Friday, it is not a mode that is suitable to that to manage safely. And so we've been focused on sod props in sensitive hours, so nighttime, nighttime. And also during non-peak, less busy periods on weekends. The recent direction will continue that work, and then there's a range of activities to unlock some of the constraints on sod props during daytime, Monday to Friday. Brisbane's not at full capacity all day, every day, Monday to Friday. It has peaks and troughs like all airports, and so we're continuing to look to unlock other constraints. Things like the Amberley airspace has been a constraint for us. Things like the way aircraft depart and arrive into Archerfield has been a constraint for us, as well as changes into flights that go to north into Sunshine Coast and south into Coolangatta. So we have processes in place to make some of those changes. I have to say, as it relates to Amberley, that I haven't got a time frame for you on that, Senator. That continues to be a dialogue. We're working with the Department of Defence as to how we can ensure they meet their mission objectives, as well as us looking after civilian operations. But those other changes I've talked about, we expect to make in the course of either June or November next year. So in the course of next year, we will unlock further opportunity for sod props that will take us beyond that 5% number that Mr Sharp mentioned before.
Senator, just to give you a sense for that, so if we implement this at the end of November, start of calendar 25, there's about 11,200 flights that will now be operating on sod props. So that's a benefit to about 300,000 to 500,000 residents for each one of those flights.
Right, okay. What about there was a lot of complaints about the full runway trial not being done properly, and particularly the height markers weren't changed for pilots. Do you have a response to that? Is that true that when you did the full runway trial, the actual descent and ascent for the pilots was the same as without it?
Senator, we published a range of updates on our website around that, and I recall the evidence that was given by Qantas in particular at the Brisbane session of this inquiry some months ago, where the issue with the height marker was a suggestion that we should have lifted the height marker. That's a different design. That's a trial of changing the standard instrument design, which would have taken considerably more time to redesign. What we undertook was a trial to see whether essentially the geometry of departing from the full length of the runway, meaning an aircraft would get airborne earlier, they would be higher over those suburbs that are closest in to the airport, Hendra, those kinds of locations. The results we got were that it was mixed, and where those flights were higher, they weren't substantially higher, and the evidence that we got was that it was around about 2 decibels difference.
No, I saw that.
Which we're advised by the acoustics experts is not typically perceptible. Less than about 3 dB is not perceptible. So the trial wasn't successful insofar as we weren't able to make a material difference. But the notion that the trial was set up to be a failure, I think, is not a fair suggestion. We looked to deploy that trial very rapidly in February of 2022. I believe it was 21 or 22. I think it was 22. In response to the then group that was established by the minister, and we gathered that data and have been very transparent around that. There was a similar trial done in Perth years earlier, and it gave mixed results. And so we wanted to be cautious all the way through that this may be an opportunity to improve things. It may not. There were other trials we undertook, and some of those were more successful, and we've continued to deploy those.
But just try and explain to me, if you haven't changed the height marker that the pilot hits, how can it make a difference? Like, isn't that, I mean, whether or not you're saying that's a totally different trial or not, what was the point of doing it if they're going to hit the same height anyway? The
height marker is the minimum altitude that the flight needs to be at for safety reasons. They're cleared to a higher altitude. This was very much the evidence of Qantas also. Yes. They're cleared to a higher altitude. It's the minimum altitude that they need to make from a safety
But why would they go to
viewpoint.
a higher height? That'll take more fuel, won't it? They won't do that if you don't require them to.
If they're taking off earlier and the engine thrust is the same, then they would, from a point of view of geometry, be over those suburbs. I'll get to the same point. They'll be higher until I get to that particular point, or higher if they're climbing to a higher altitude. That's the theory behind the trial. It is possible that some operators were able to adjust their engine settings to be able to use the additional runway length to reduce thrust, and as a consequence take almost the same trajectory. We don't have that data, but as we looked at it through the geometry that we do have, it's possible that happened, but we don't know that.
You don't even know. You can't even.
We don't know what engine settings are.
No, well, do you know what heights they're at different?
We have the altitudes,
okay.
But we don't know all the factors that cause that. There are weight consideration, wind considerations. There's a myriad of variables that make it a bit hard.
Do we set these height markers for noise at all? Or is it only for safety?
They are done from a safety viewpoint. We did actually undertake some additional work, which we engaged with the ministerial appointed body, the AAB, in Brisbane, the Airport Airspace Advisory Body, and we looked at the potential with Qantas and Virgin to get to a height that would be perceptible, that would make a difference. What gradient would we need to set? And we did some analysis on that, and Qantas and Virgin both confirmed that gradient would not be something that would be flyable.
What, like flyable as in?
Too aggressive an angle.
It was from a safety perspective, or from a commercial, from an economic perspective?
The engine settings on an aircraft are set by the manufacturer, and you can buy various settings effectively. So if you want a more powerful engine, there's more wear and tear, and it comes at a massive cost. So typically when an airline orders a fleet, they set the thrust settings at a particular level. The steeper the climb, ultimately you reach a point where that thrust setting needs to be high. In other words, you need more power, so more wear and tear. So the industry can't just flick a switch and say, well, we'll re-rate the engine. It's actually a massive exercise right across the fleet. So that's the issue in terms of the gradient. There is a limit to actually how steep you can actually fly the aircraft.
But
so that's the quantity.
But you're saying you're not the steepness, the gradient's not being set from a noise perspective at all, anyway.
Safety perspective.
Only safety,
that's correct.
And presumably for efficiency from an airline perspective, they'll be.
Yes, there's an efficiency perspective, but you're also designing in a busy environment like Brisbane. You have a series of other airports that you're looking. It's essentially a set of highways in the sky. So there's a range of other considerations. There are flight paths you're looking to get over, flight paths you're looking to stay under. There's a series of other considerations as we design an environment like Brisbane, which is quite complex and reasonably busy.
I mean, I just want to go quickly back to one thing that I forgot with the sod drops, the wind settings. I believe at the moment at Brisbane, they're not used. It's not used when the wind is more than 5 knots. Is that right?
Senator, that's right. The approval today from a rule set viewpoint is 5 knots for downwind.
And there's a safety case to assess 7.5 knots, is that right?
It was 7 knots, Senator.
7 knots, sorry.
Air Services did work in the course of last year to undertake a safety assessment. We worked with industry, worked with BAC, Brisbane Airport Corporation, to put forward a safety assessment to CASA. CASA reviewed that and formed the view that they couldn't support it and suggested there was additional information that we should seek to gather for a range of considerations. I won't speak for CASA. And so in the post that exercise, Air Services has supported BAC in continuing to explore some trials to see whether there's a more limited way that we can gather more data, which may support a safety case, which in due course would be resubmitted to CASA. That decision hasn't been made yet, but that's what we're undertaking.
So there's no ongoing safety case?
BAC and Air Services are working on an activity, but we're gathering data through trials. So right now today, BAC have engaged with, I think it's 3 or 4 airlines, typically international carriers that are operating at sensitive times of day, at night time, and they are engaging with them from a perspective that weather and flight conditions permitting, weight of the aircraft, a range of considerations that the pilot in command on an individual case-by-case basis would elect to take an over-the-bay operation in up to 7 knots. And that's the case that today the rule set allows for pilots to make that decision. What the rule set doesn't allow for today is a carte blanche resetting from 5 knots to 7 knots. So individual airlines, individual pilots can make that assessment within company procedures and within some other considerations.
And Senator, just the discussions to bookend it, there are the Pilot Association which would like to keep it at the 5 knots international standard, but there are international airports that do run 7 to 10 knot tailwind. So Detroit, Brussels International, Macau International airports run through 7 to 10 knots. So there are precedents. However, it is up to us to actually work across the industry to create the safety case and to address the various concerns that are put up. So that process is underway and continuing. Okay, all right. I might at this point then ask CASA then, what happened to the... So the safety case was rejected, was it? The proposal was rejected? If so why? Why was it?
It was, Chair. So the issue with setting a new parameter is that it applies to all flights. So if we were to move from a 5 knot limit to a 7 knot limit, it means that applies to everyone that's arriving at the airport. There are a lot of aircraft that operate that have a different varying limits. So our concern with when you set it to a standard that is higher than the internationally accepted standard, you have airlines that aren't potentially ready to operate to that higher standard. I think you heard through the Brisbane hearing some of the safety risks of having a higher tailwind, higher touchdown speeds, higher descent rates, unstable approaches. So there's a number of safety risks with a higher tailwind. And as Mr Curran said, individual airlines and crews might be able to make an assessment that for their particular configuration on that day, they're okay to do that. But once we change the setting, then that's a setting that applies to everyone coming into the airport, and we were not satisfied that the risk assessment had adequately considered all the different types of aircraft and users that go into an airport.
Okay, thank you. And so why can't we just do it for the aircraft that can do 7 knots or more?
If we had certainty that that was the only aircraft that was coming in for a period of time, air services might be able to switch a mode, but when you've got a mix of aircraft arriving or departing of various types, you can't be changing modes every couple of minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Senator, if I may, just to reinforce what CASA has said there, it's and that's why we've worked with BAC, that this is focused on nighttime operations when we're typically much quieter. Also, it's a much more sensitive time for residents and community. But typically in really low traffic periods, we can have a situation where a pilot of an individual flight says, I would like to have a different runway to that which is nominated for operational use. We can then slot that in during a busy period of time during the middle of the day when other aircraft are in.
But that's not when you want to use
this. It's
anyway.
not practical, and so we're not looking at that.
What was the original safety case? Was 7 knots all times, all planes?
It was looking to allow the rules.
So you're going to adjust that now, are you?
So that's the work we're doing with BAC. They're actually undertaking work jointly with us. We're supporting them, and we'll form a view around our ability to resubmit to CASA in due course.
All right. And just going back to the noise action plan more generally, and I'll share the call in a second, although I do have more questions. And I think particularly the recommendations that came out of the original TRACS report, at the Brisbane hearings, the Brisbane Airport Corporation gave evidence that of the 40, there were 49 recommendations that came out of, they said, the original TRACS report. To their knowledge at this time, a few months ago, only 3 of those 49 had been introduced, and they also said another 10 to 12 probably this year. How many have been introduced now of the 49?
Senator, just a moment. I'm just pulling up some data here, if I may.
Sure.
Senator, as of July 2024, we've had 17 actions that are fully complete.
Right.
8 are awaiting implementation in November this year. They are related to flight path changes that we produce a chart cycle twice annually. 20 are in progress where we're looking to make a decision in 2024, and that's because we've already gone out and undertaken community consultation. We've received that feedback, and so we're now in a position to look to make decisions and then implement in due course. And there's a further 14 that we'll be looking to consult. We're consulting just recently, but again, consulting next year for a decision in 2025. Right.
So when were the 49 recommendations originally proposed?
The TRACS report formed the basis. It was an independent report, formed the basis of our finalising our post-implementation review. And so that was all finalised in, bear with me, December 2022.
Right. Okay. So it's taken 18 months to do 10 of them or so?
Senator, there has been some delay with some of the items. That's correct. There's been some rework. There's been a number of elements that we thought we could go out to community consult once and then potentially make a decision to implement. We received the sort of feedback that required us to make adjustments and then consult again. I think you'd understand, given some of the challenge we had with consultation previously, we're looking to make sure that we've completed all the necessary consultation before implementing any further changes.
Now, I just want to ask one question of the department before I go to others. I'm just confused exactly how safety gets factored into the development of master plans, noise, whatever they want to call them, flight path design. Where is that factored into in that design process? So just say safety, noise. When noise is factored in, obviously safety is top of the mark. But how is noise factored into the planning for flight paths, for new runways, for new airports, etc.?
Sarah Natty, Assistant Secretary of Airports Branch. Thanks for the question, Chair. The master plans that are specified in the Airports Act 1996 have that under section 71(2)(d), the master plan that's presented to the government must specify the ANEF, the Australian Noise Exposure Forecast, for areas that are surrounding the airport. In reality, this means that the ALC must present technically endorsed ANEF, technically endorsed by Air Services Australia, which provides the likely noise profile, which depends on aircraft capacity, the runways being used and the flight paths once they're agreed by Air Services, once that design has been agreed.
So from what I heard there, does that mean under the Act, and I'm not blaming you, of course, it's an act of this Parliament, on our side, not yours. So under this Act, you just have to publish the noise information. You don't have to minimise it or seek to reduce it in any way.
Senator, that's for the master plan, that you must present that information for the Minister's consideration when she's contemplating whether to approve a master plan. Then when the airport lessee company brings forward a major development plan, it's at that point under section 91(1)(e) and F that the MDP, the major development plan, must set out if the development could affect noise exposure levels at the airport, and that the ALCs must present plans for managing aircraft noise intrusion in areas forecast to be subject to exposure above the significant ANEF levels, which are then expressed in the master plan. So the MDP must be consistent with the master plan. That's one of the
But the word is managing, is it? There's not minimising or mitigating. The word in the Act is managing.
The word in the Act is managing, Senator.
How is that interpreted in practice then?
In reality, it means that
do you need to try and take steps to reduce it? Is that something that...
There are a couple of things that we can do. So in reality, it means that we check the appropriate mitigation of noise brought about by the development, and we check that against the Australian Standard 2021:2015. If on the assessment against that particular, and it's a table that's set within the standard, if the department's assessment is that the information provided by the ALC is not appropriate, it has three options open to it. It can seek further information from the ALC under a request for information process. It may be grounds for the Minister to refuse the MDP, or there may be conditions imposed upon the ALC in approving the MDP.
I mean, what's more, obviously safety is the most important thing. What's more important when you consider these plans, noise or efficiency?
I think we would take the view, Senator, that safety is always the number one.
I said that. So we've done safety. Safety's above and beyond everything. Below that, what's next optimised? Noise or efficiency?
We present an assessment to the Minister which provides the department's view of the elements that the ALC has presented in the MDP, and those assessments are they're binary, so that either the ALC has demonstrated that it's met the requirement under the Act, or it has not demonstrated that it's met the requirement.
I'm struggling to understand what the requirement is. I mean, it doesn't really seem to require much at all in terms of noise.
Under the Act, it is about managing the aircraft noise.
I mean, it seems everything we get, or the feedback, it seems like efficiency is put before everything else, apart from safety, of course. So I'm just trying to understand how this is assessed. And now I see in the white paper we've got a new thing. We've got decarbonisation has to be prioritised. So what's more important from the department's perspective, the government's perspective really? Is it reducing carbon emissions or reducing noise impacts on local communities?
So I think, Senator, shall I take this one? Yep. The major development plan process requires the Minister to consider the extent to which carrying out the plan meets the needs of civil aviation users of the airport. So the users of the airport are important, and other users of the airport. It requires the Minister to consider the effect that carrying out the plan would be likely to have on the future operating capacity of the airport. So yes, the future operating capacity of the airport is important. She also needs to consider the impact that carrying out the plan would be likely to have on the environment, and she consults with the Minister for Environment on that matter. She considers whether consultation has been adequate in preparing the plan and how the airport company has taken into account the outcomes of those consultations. And then she also has to consider the views of CASA and Air Services as regard to safety aspects and operational aspects. So the impact that the major development plan has on the environment is one of the 5 factors that the Minister must have regard to. She then has the discretion to have regard to any other matters that she considers relevant. And as you will have seen in the Melbourne Airport Third Runway Major Development Plan, she did consider that noise amelioration was something that was relevant and imposed a condition with regard to that. So there is flexibility to take that into account, and consultation with the community and the impact on the environment are no lesser than the future needs of civil aviation users, but they're also no greater.
But noise is not mentioned in any of those.
Well, noise is part of the environmental impact.
Very vague, though. It's not. Why wouldn't?
Well, that's
seems strange that. I mean, look, I can't ask you that's an opinion, but it seems strange to me that
that's what the
that's what the legislation says. So
that's what the legislation says. The legislation was, of course, put into place in 1996, and as it's become obvious that community expectations have changed around the impact of noise on communities. The Minister has taken that into account in making decisions and using the discretion that she is able to under the Act. So it is able to be taken into account, but I agree with you, it's not specifically required by the legislation.
Just going back to my original question,
yes,
what the government's priorities, happy for you to take on notice, is what's more important, reducing carbon emissions or reducing noise on local communities?
Well, they're not, I'm not sure that, well, the government is already taking into account noise impacts through the master plan and major development.
Can I get you to take that on notice? Take it on notice and ask your Minister what's more important.
Okay.
I mean, it's a very simple question. What's more important? Are they equally important? One's more important than the other? That's all I want to know. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Okay. Well, I'll go to another party. Did you want Senator Hodgins-May?
I have quite a few questions, but I'll pause partway through to give others a chance in case we don't. But we've touched on SODROP and Minister King's commitment and the ministerial direction that has recently been sent. So, as you're probably aware, Minister King made a commitment last year in October via a letter to Adam Bant that she would, pending approval from AAB, which was subsequently given, issue a ministerial direction to SODROPS, the preferred operating, to make SODROPS the preferred operating mode at Brisbane Airport at all hours, which was something that was originally promised with the new runway, then dropped before it opened. She appears to have made this direction on Monday this week. Can you please confirm your understanding of that the direction is to make SODROPS preferred operating mode at all hours? Yeah.
Senator, thank you. We welcome the direction. Obviously, we've been working through the noise action plan, and the Minister's holding our feet to the fire to actually deliver. There's 3 components in there. One is the delivery by November of the current hours, and extending those, which is the weekends, and growing the amount of sod props. That is something that's occurring. We also have actions that are coming through that will take longer than November to deliver, and we're consulting on those, technically more challenging. We will be returning to the Minister on those to say we'll give you quarterly updates and we'll be progressing those, and that's looking at all hours. Now, in practice, how often that will occur will obviously depend on the conditions, but that is the mechanism. I'll pass to Mr Curran to talk to those items that will actually deliver that benefit potentially.
Thank you. So the ministerial direction issued this week in relation to sod props references the Noise Action Plan Initiative 2.1. There's a series of other noise action plan initiatives that relate directly to sod props 2.2, 2.3 that relate to some of the elements that we will be pursuing over time to continue to expand sod props use during the day, notably. So it's the mode for evenings, it's the mode for weekends, and we use use it in the day whenever we can. Given the capacity that we're able to achieve with sod props, it's not expected that we'll be doing it during peak periods. What we do understand is that if we can unlock some of the blockages in military airspace at Amberley and some of the flight path changes, which will take longer than November, we'll be able to continue to expand the use of sod props. That's what the Noise Action Plan says, and that's what we'll be continuing to do in line with the ministerial direction.
Thank you. So yeah, it will be the preferred operating mode at all hours. You're saying not, even if you can't use it, it will be the preferred operating model at all hours.
I think it's important that we're also very clear about expectations, noting some of the previous expectations of the Brisbane community regarding the EIS and the hours that were forecast in that. As I've said earlier in questioning from Senator Canavan, the ability to use sod props
I appreciate that it's limited.
Is not realistic, and I think it's very important we set we give that transparency and openness to the Brisbane community that we will only be able to deliver it during less busy periods of time. Peak periods is not something that's realistic.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate the significant restrictions on it, but just really wanted to clarify that it will be the preferred operating mode where it's safe, where conditions permit for it to be at all hours. Yeah.
Traffic and weather permitting, we will look to use the mode.
Yeah, thank you. Following up from my question on Notice 279, which we only got the answer to yesterday, it was about the conditions on sod props use and what Brisbane Airport was aware of prior to the new runway opening. You've said that Brisbane Airport were aware of the conditions on the use of sod props per their EIS. Can you outline what those conditions were and whether there are any differences between those conditions and how sod props operates currently?
Do you mind just reminding me what was the quantity you were referencing?
279.
279. Thank you. I'm just struggling to find that quant. I have got it marked here in my index, so I'm just looking for the actual number.
I can go on to another following question while you have a look for it, if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Senator.
Yeah.
I may just ask for...
Yeah, and we can print it, I'm being told. So I'll continue.
I don't have that. I think they're going to get me a copy of it.
Yeah, great. We heard at the Brisbane hearing and from submissions that the community in Brisbane feels like they were misled on sod props. They were misled that they would be used more often than it actually is. We know that Brisbane Airport CEO was on TV in January 2020 saying the net effect of flying over the city would decrease on the basis of being able to use sod props with the two runways. At the Brisbane hearing, BAC tried to defend themselves by saying that a gulf lies between the way we described it operating as the way that the runway system was designed and the way that it's operating now, accusing air services of being the source of that gulf. BAC seems like they were essentially accusing air services of misleading them, and I'm curious as to what your response to that is.
Senator, we're familiar with the BAC evidence at the hearing. I think the best answer our services can give to that is to reference the EIS. I have a document here which I'm happy to table if that's acceptable from the EIS. And this is two what we consider to be quite important tables that show the EIS forecast for the different runway modes that would be used in the year 2015 based on the then traffic projections done in 2007 and then again through to 2035. What these two tables present is a use of a number of modes, and if you'll bear with me for a moment, there's a little bit of history and detail here. When the EIS was initiated in 2006-07, it was envisaged that there would be a mode called DOD props. I'm sorry for the extra acronym. Dependent opposite direction parallel runway operations, and another mode called SOD props. Simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway operations. For the purposes of today's discussion, I think it'd be fair to say that the main difference between the two was the amount of downwind, a tailwind that an aircraft could land with. From 2007 until about 2017, when Air Services took accountability for designing the final detailed flight paths, the use of DOD props was discounted. It was discounted because of the 10 knots factor, so it was no longer a mode that could be used. That obviously changed the mix on which people were consulted back in 2007 and left industry, Air Services, BAC, with a mode referenced as SOD props, which we've then sought to move forward with and utilise. The forecast for SOD props is done in two seasons, a summer and a winter period, and the forecast was that it would be used in 2015 somewhere between 10%, around 10% in summer and around 17%, up to 17% in winter periods in 2015. By 2035, the forecast was it would not be used at all during daytime and would be limited to a nighttime mode. That was also based on the fact that there would be a higher tailwind permitted. So a number of things changed on the way through that meant that we've not been able to use SOD props for the number of hours that the community would have expected from back in 2007 and which we would have expected to do back at that time as well. So those factors have come to bear, and that's why I think it's fair to say some community members would feel that they were given one expectation around use of SOD props and another has materialised. As we said before, we used it, SOD props in 2023 calendar year, approximately 2% of the time. We think will be a little bit more than 5% of the time following the ministerial direction in 2025, and we intend to continue to work toward that. I think it's a really important point, Senator, that from 2015 to 2035, the forecast was to go from that percentage range I mentioned before, between 10 and 17, down to essentially 0% in daytime. And so at 5%, 7%, in that kind of order, we're probably around about, we're midway between 15 and 35, we're probably around about where the decrease in the use of SOD props would have been had we not had COVID and a few of the other changes that have impacted our ability to run SOD props.
Thank you. And when did BAC know this information? Do you know?
I'd have to take that on notice, I'm afraid. I don't know when BAC knew what.
Yeah, okay, that'd be great.
In fact, actually, I should probably reframe that. I don't think I can say when BAC knew what. BAC would know what they know when they know it. I couldn't offer any more on that. We could take on notice when we became aware of some of these changes.
Yeah, please, that would be helpful. Shall we go back to my previous question on, have you got that in front of you now?
Sorry. The answer we provided you, I'll just quickly restate that if I may. Air Services Australia fact sheet, increasing the use of simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway operations has been revised to clarify that this statement refers to daytime use of SOD props, not nighttime. As the proponents of the new runway project, BAC took the lead on community engagement. The conditions for the use of SOD prop were specified in the EIS. And that's referencing your earlier question on the specifics of how SOD props, the weather conditions and the like that are necessary for SOD props.
So, thank you. So the conditions that you referred to in that response, can you spell out what those were, please?
Yes, I can. Senator, perhaps I'm not fully clear on the question. The conditions that I'm referencing are the conditions that are in your question, which relate to the meteorological conditions which we require for SOD props. We need a cloud ceiling of no less than 2,500 feet, a tailwind of not more than 5 knots, a visibility of not less than 8 kilometres, and a dry runway. They're the criteria that we require in order to operate simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway operations. And then in addition to that, we need to have traffic levels that are typically less than 20 arrivals per hour in order for us to be able to go to that mode.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just clarify, the modelling that was relied on when the EIS was being developed, was that based on a knot speed of 10 rather than 5?
Yeah, I can double check that, yes. Yes, it was.
So does that explain the biggest disappointment or the reason for the disappointment?
So that's certainly a significant factor, which goes to the earlier question, I think, or answers to your earlier question, Senator, regarding our desire to see whether we could get 7 knots downwind would give us, we think, a number of percentage points more use of sod props. 10 knots would be more again, but that was the modelling that was originally done.
10 knots.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, because basically what we're trying to get to is why the BAC were allowed.
Sorry, may I just correct that? Sorry, I've just had, Senator, sorry, night time was 10 knots, daytime was 5 knots, Senator. That was that DOD props mode that I mentioned before. That had a 10 knots allowance.
At night, which is really the key time for the use of
yes,
that.
it is. But Senator, if I could share, I think an important number for you in terms of our ability to deliver sod props at night at present. For the last 6 months of this year, we've been, with the conditions I just stepped the Senator through in relation to sod props, there's a certain number of hours in the week in which we're able to practically deliver sod props given those weather and traffic limitations. And between January and June of this year, there were 246 nighttime hours where the environmental conditions were such that we could have run sod props. Of those 246 hours, we ran it for 218 hours, so about 88% of the time. So nearly...
Doesn't sound like a lot, though, over 6 months. How many hours over 6 months?
Well, it's all... Of the times that it would be possible, which is... I mean, we control many...
But you're still only doing 50...
But not
still
the
only
weather.
50%? Or
well, of the times at night when we're able to do it because of weather, we're doing it 88.5% of the time in the last 6 months. Now, we've been working up toward this, and we think, we'll continue to improve. The reason why there's a difference between the 218 hours and the 246, why is it not 100%, is because sometimes there's additional traffic, there's a helicopter operation, emergency operation that's necessary. There is some transition time into that mode and out of that mode. But broadly speaking, our team in Brisbane Tower, our team in Brisbane, air traffic control, when at night time it's possible to do it, we are doing it 88% of the time.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's fine. Thank you. Basically, it was just trying to understand why BAC were saying what they were saying and whether there was any knowledge of that change before they were going out and making those representations. So I'll wait to get that timeline back. But next question, did Air Services provide any oversight over BAC's community engagement?
Senator, oversight is not what we did.
Yeah.
And this has been one of the learnings through the process, the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman's review. We worked with BAC, we were engaged with BAC. If I go back to the 2007 ministerial approval, there's very clear conditions in the ministerial approval of the MDP that Brisbane was to be accountable for community engagement associated with the third runway, I beg your pardon, the parallel runway. And so Air Services provided technical advice. We were engaged in supporting them. We had our air traffic controllers participate in a broad range of community awareness activities. They had a bus that they took, and our assessment was that they did a very extensive job on community awareness raising activities. The ANO found that there were some shortcomings in what Air Services could have done in terms of making clear the impacts of the change as opposed to perhaps the benefits of the change. And we accepted all of those recommendations, and we've sought to make changes in our procedures and processes since.
So I suppose I'm just interested in why they were allowed to say what they were saying about sod props and setting potentially those false expectations amongst the community if you were quite involved in that consultation engagement process.
Yeah. Senator, as I said, we had a very technical role supporting it. It was never our role to oversight it. Well, I think we're very, very much clearer post the Brisbane experience that our obligations are never extinguished by a third party's activities. And so today we take a stronger focus on understanding what the third party, an airport or anyone else engaged in a proposal that will lead to a flight path change in the messages that they will be providing, and we ensure that they meet the standard to which we are held to account through our national operating standard, and where necessary we augment community engagement to ensure that we've extinguished our obligations.
And Senator, just to put a bit of colour to that, if you go back in history, define decibels, consultation was targeted at areas where that occurs. But noticeability is something that was picked up out of that period. So if you're in a rural area, even if the decibels are within range, it is actually noticeable when that change occurs. And so we're actually held to account in terms of also where communities are noticing a change, we need to consult with them. That's one of the learnings, and it's something we're taking forward.
Thank you. That might lead into last question on this topic. Can you provide an update on recommendation 3 of the 2021 ANO report, being Air Services update its third-party framework to ensure that Air Services obligations regarding community engagement are properly acquitted when it enters into cooperative arrangements for community engagement with third parties. Do you have any further information around what action you've taken to implement this recommendation?
Yes. Senator, I'll pass to Ms Marshall to talk specifically to that.
Senators, Donna Marshall, Head of Community Engagement with Air Services Australia. So that particular recommendation, we had developed a third-party framework ahead of receiving that recommendation. Following receipt of that, we did go through and update it, and we added, I guess, just some more clarity around what our obligations are in relation to that engagement. We shared those updates with the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman, and he closed out that recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Ms Marshall. My next question is related to leaded fuel. Do you need... Is this okay to ask this particular panel? Yeah. I want to follow up on an unanswered question on notice to CASA about the use of leaded fuel, question number SQ240000959. Do you want me to read it again?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I don't have it in front of me.
SQ24-000959.
So, Senator, I don't have that one with me.
Oh, you don't have it with you? Basically,
yeah.
I was just going to follow up and say, is it correct that neither the Department, Air Services Australia nor CASA collect data about the use of leaded fuel?
That's correct, yes.
You don't?
We don't collect data. And to my knowledge, nobody does. Yeah.
Is it correct that leaded fuel is used by aircraft at both Brisbane Airport and Archerfield Airport?
So low lead fuel is used by most general aviation aircraft around the country, yes.
And is there any explanation why no one collects data on this?
So I guess the data would only exist in the volumes of fuel sold. The fuel providers might be able to provide volumes, but there's no requirement for anyone at this table to collect that data, so nobody does that.
I'm aware that aircraft out of Archerfield Airport operate as mostly uncontrolled airspace below the arrival and departure paths from Brisbane Airport. Is that correct?
I think that's a better question for Mr Curran.
Sorry, I can repeat. That Archerfield... Did you hear me the question? Or?
I beg your pardon.
No, absolutely fine. That aircraft out of Archerfield Airport operate as mostly uncontrolled airspace below the arrival and departure paths from Brisbane Airport.
Senator, I don't think I could say that that's mostly the case. It can be the case.
Can be the case. Okay.
That Archerfield Airport is not a 24-hour operation, and so depending on the time of day, depending on the particular destination and the flight path an individual flight wishes to take, they may be in controlled airspace or they may not be. And also depending on the flight rules that particular operation is operating to, Air Services may be providing a service or may not be providing a service.
So the aircraft using lead-based fuel from Archerfield Airport are not being monitored anyway in their fuel use, and they also aren't following any designated flight paths necessarily. It varies.
That could be the case. Yeah. If they're operating visually, they're complying with they may well be complying with all the rules. It's possible to operate visually and not be receiving a service from us. Yeah. It's possible to be operating visually and be receiving a service from us. It really would depend. It's very difficult to give a precise answer on that particular question.
I just raised those as the community has been made aware through confidential submission of a positive test for lead in tank water on a property located in Brisbane and not close to high traffic road or industry. This is believed to be attributed to low-flying aircraft using lead-based fuel We also know that the Environment Protection Agency in the US said last year that emissions of lead from aircraft that operate on leaded fuel cause or contribute to air pollution, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. As a result, in the US, they're aiming to stop using lead fuel by 2030. Considering this, I'm just curious as to why the government doesn't monitor the use of leaded fuel and what lessons we might learn from that.
Senator Marisa Purvis-Smith, Deputy Secretary Transport. I think as has been mentioned at the table, there is no requirements in any of the acts for us to monitor leaded fuel at the moment. So there is no agency at the moment that is monitoring the use of leaded fuel.
It just seems concerning that Archerfield Airport's right next to a primary school, Acacia Ridge State School, and we've got significant concerns that there's no way the government can be sure that lead pollution isn't affecting the kids at that school. From my understanding, lead-based fuel isn't mentioned at all in the aviation white paper. Why is this? Do you have any response to maybe why it's not mentioned in the white paper?
The white paper is the government's policies for aviation going forward, and they're the decisions that the government has made in relation to the aviation sector for the white paper.
Okay, so yeah, no more information about potential plans to phase out the use of leaded fuel.
No, so part of the issue, Senator, is most of our general aviation fleet is very old, and those aircraft and those engines were designed for a particular fuel type. So that's the challenge that we all face.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Senator Hodgins-May. Senator Colbeck.
Look, just some probably more general questions in relation to, or off the back of some of the questions Senator Canavan asked. With respect to the South East Queensland Basin, if you like, if you want to call it that, and you did allude to the fact that there are a number of intersecting flight paths, airports, Amberley, Sunshine Coast, Brisbane, Gold Coast. And there was some discussion this morning in evidence about basically looking at the structure of that more broadly. Is there a realistic requirement for that, given some of the issues that we're looking at, the growth in demand to all of those airports, if you like, and then being able to sort out some of the issues that exist there? You've mentioned the operational requirements of Amberley, for example, which have their own levels of precedence, if you like, but I'd be curious to know what that might look like, and whether it's a desirable exercise.
Yes, thank you, Senator. I'll pass to Peter Curran, but just to set the scene on it, it is one of the complexities that we are currently working through. We do see in the short term some benefits, but ultimately the growth in the area will continue. The airport runway will see more traffic, and we have got Trax International who are working with us, providing some independent advice in what are called high growth areas. There's a lot of intersections between the flight paths, and so it is very complex. Is there an overlay there which is a negative risk for the area? I'll pass to Mr. Curran.
And I'll just toss in as part of that, one of the discussions was getting more of the flights out over the ocean. It has other implications, clearly, but was one of the considerations that was put to us.
Senator, thank you.
I think a little context in relation to the way that Air Services designs the airspace. When an airport, in this case Brisbane, proposes a master plan or a major development proposal for an additional runway, we seek to design the airspace so that it can accommodate the future growth that's in the forecast that is sort of underpins a lot of that major development proposal. So from a purely capacity viewpoint, the parallel runway structure will sustain the growth that we think is planned for, anticipated, or forecast for Brisbane. That same process applies to Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast as we look to work with those airports to understand what their future forecasts are. So from purely a capacity viewpoint, the airspace structures are probably suitable. There's always minor modifications over time, but they're broadly suitable. I think the question that we are asking through the Noise Action Plan Package 4, which looks to ask exactly the question that you've put around a more holistic redesign, is can we deliver that capacity with a different flight path structure that gives improved community outcomes in terms of noise with other environmental considerations as well. So that's the work of what we call Package 4, which is, as Mr Sharp has mentioned, we've got a consultant in helping us with. I don't think I could say is it desirable necessarily. There will always be some complexities and implications, and we need to start that work, or I beg your pardon, evolve that work to a point where we can start to fully understand the implications for all of the airports, communities and stakeholders, so that we get the balance between community outcomes and industry outcomes right.
So so you talked Package 4, so what would that piece of work look like in reality, and sort of what is the time frame that it might take to undertake that bit of work, bearing in mind that you are looking at not just one but a number of, in terms of airports even, affected parties.
That's correct, Senator. So that Package 4 work we're developing at present and into next year to get some options. There's a question around, so what are some practical outcomes? At the moment, Brisbane Airport works on a compass basis, which essentially means that flights that are going to the north typically will depart off the northerly runway, parallel runway. Flights going to the south will typically go off the south. That creates some efficiencies, it creates some inefficiencies, particularly as you interface with other airports. So the thought to do a broad basin redesign of all flight paths would entail significant community engagement, significant industry engagement and significant safety work. So we'd look to make the changes necessary to get benefits for community and balance that with industry. So I think that the plain answer is we'd make as much change as we have to get outcomes, but as little as possible.
So little as possible to maintain familiarity with existing structures?
As much change as we need to improve the balance with community outcomes, but as little as we can, because we will still need to deliver the capacity that we are expected to deliver, and per the appropriate approvals, ministerial approvals for Brisbane Airport's MDP. So we still need to deliver that capacity. We just need to see whether we can do so in a way that gives better outcomes for communities.
Senator, if I could just add, I talked earlier about the challenge for Air Services balancing multiple facets when we do this work. The military airspace factors into this particular equation. We've obviously got to weigh up the benefits and pros and cons of what the implications are for the military as well. Typically they've got longer range capacity, and that is something under the One Sky program that we're working on. How do we actually jointly manage civil and military airspace? So there's other programs in the medium term that will also have some implications here. So it's quite a complex environment.
No, I get the complexity of it. I don't in any way underestimate that. Particularly when they toss the military stuff in as well, because that brings a whole heap of other layers in as well that isn't necessarily understood or transparent, if you like. I just want to go back to one of the other questions that Senator Canavan asked, and I've asked a couple of people this morning around experience in other jurisdictions, and I've referenced the circumstance at Heathrow where you've got the 7,000 feet threshold, where mitigation of noise below that threshold becomes a high priority in whatever the hierarchies are, and you know, we've talked about efficiency, fuel efficiency, emission reductions, all of those things. So I suppose perhaps a question to you and also to the department as well about the realities and the practicalities of that in a way to provide satisfaction to the communities that when they're raising something there's a possibility of an outcome rather than a consultation which just tells them how it's going to be.
Senator, that's a good question. I'll start if the department likes. Basically, the state and local planning, governments are responsible for the planning and the zoning around an airport and the implications or the impacts of noise around an airport. So when there's developments, that is something that's taken into consideration. The Australian Noise Exposure Forecast is the reference point there. And it does depend on where you are in the cycle. So, for example, if it's taking over a decade in Brisbane for the airport, EIS and planning, the city grew substantially through that period. So there is a planning element here in terms of answering that question in terms of noise density around a particular airport, particularly when there's new infrastructure.
I get all that, and I understand different levels of government and institutions within the system have responsibilities in that sense. But I'm talking about an application of something within the way that flight paths are designed. So what I'm looking to do is to avoid the duck shoving between different levels of government, if you like, as it would be put to me by other witnesses sitting in your seat from a community perspective, and how a regulatory environment might provide the opportunity for an outcome for them and a priority for an outcome from them, other than things like fuel efficiency for the airlines or carbon reductions for some other priority.
Yeah, understood. I'll pass to Mr. Curran to talk about the flight path specifically.
Thank you, Senator. I think I understand the reference to the UK environment. The Department for Transport in the UK stipulates below 7 and above 7,000 feet.
Yes.
And there's some more precision.
Above 7,000, go for your life, do whatever it is the airline wants, if you like, and below that it's a different story, as I understand.
That's broadly correct. In fact, we made it included in our submission to this inquiry some evidence regarding that. In fact, there's a little nuance between 4 and 7,000. They seek a balanced outcome. Below 4,000, it's community bias, and above 7, it's sort of industry bias is how it works. And that kind of thinking helps to guide flight path design work and is clearly helpful in the context of the UK. That approach isn't the case in Australia today, and so we have our flight path design principles, which we also provided as an attachment to our submission, and those flight path design principles really inform our broad approach to how we undertake design, but we don't have that level of specificity to band that. I understand the operation in the UK reasonably well, having worked there for some time. I'm aware of the way it's applied. It is effective in that environment. There are some regulatory differences in the UK around the roles of airports and the air traffic control company there that gives rise to the reason for that separation at particular altitudes. But the premise is certainly something that is helpful for the UK. It's not the approach that we've taken to date in Australia.
So that's a policy matter?
It could be a policy matter, I think, yes. I mean, in the UK, it's a policy matter. The Department for Transport sets the policy in the UK, and they've given that guidance there.
I think that provides a segue.
I'm not sure that we can talk about hypothetical
Well, I'm talking about something that actually applies and how, and so sitting here, what I might recommend. Clearly, Air Services are aware of it. Mr. Curran's worked within the system in that sense. And so and I'm looking at from where I sit at this side of the table, get where you are, about how that might apply in a recommendation sense from what we report at the end of the day. Which means that, and if we do recommend something like that, then you have to consider it because, well, the government will ask you to and come back with a response of some sort. But I'm also looking to see how it might positively impact on people who are living under a flight path, and as they see it and as they've expressed it to us, people come and talk to us about flight paths all the time, but when we try and do something about it, it's not part of the consideration of the process. Carbon emissions, fuel efficiency, airline profitability, whatever the airport says, and we're not in there, and yet in a policy sense, in this jurisdiction at least, it is a priority. So how might it apply practically into the regulatory framework? So if I'm writing a recommendation, what would I write to apply it to the policy framework?
Senator, it sounds like from what Mr Curran said that this would go into the flight path design principles, which I must admit I haven't brought a copy with me, and I'm not sure what the process for changing the flight path design principles would be.
Senator, perhaps I could advise it. The flight path design principles are a construct that Air Services has put to the community. We consulted nationally on this approach and we settled on a series of flight path design principles, which after safety, we are very clear we give equal weighting to noise and environmental considerations. There's three broad pillars. We give equal weighting. I think it would be open to take a different approach, to seek to put some banding there, and the way, if we were to do that, I imagine we would go and reconsult communities nationally before making any such choices. There'd be implications for industry, implications for communities potentially. To say it is a part of the mix in the UK. It is an approach. It's not without its challenges in terms of implementation, but it's something that we're certainly aware of and is a valid way of approaching the problem.
Well, I think as we're learning, there's nothing in aircraft in flight path design that's without challenges. So. We heard from one of the panel this morning about, in their opinion, the desirability of additional gradient levels with respect to the ANEF projections. Do you have any view on that? So it was below 20, I think, was the number that they were talking about.
The department on ANEF matters.
All right.
Thank you, Senator. So, as I think was covered, or has been covered earlier in the inquiry, the ANEF is required to be used in planning through the Airports Act. We did go through a process of consultation in the Green Paper and White Paper process around whether the ANEF remained the best method for depicting noise. And I think we received a range of different submissions, and certainly from the perspective of conveying noise information to community members, the ANEF is not considered by some to be the best way to do that. But ultimately, the decision was that for planning purposes, and the Airports Act is a plan, we are talking about planning decisions, the ultimate decision was that the ANEF remained the most effective mechanism.
And that was the evidence we received this morning, so I'm not disputing that.
Great, thank
the
you.
question is the sensitivity levels in it.
Yep.
And having additional
Yes.
sensitivity. So
Yep.
effectively expanding what
Yep.
was described to us as the best mechanism to use for predictions, but having additional sensitivity levels built into it, because that would pick up, would better pick up the projected impacts on
Yes.
individuals
Yep.
from the flight path. So it's not.
Yep.
There was no dispute from these guys about utilising ANEF. They were very, very comfortable with that,
Yep.
but saw the opportunity for higher levels of sensitivity built into the design.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. So 2 things on that from the white paper. The first is that I think, as someone has testified already today, the ANEF is largely contained in Australian Standard 2021-2015. The government has applied to Standards Australia to have that standard revised, so brought up to date, and Standards Australia has accepted the application, so they will revise that standard. The second thing in the white paper is that...
So before we go to the second
Yes,
thing,
please.
sorry,
Yep.
would that provide the opportunity to increase the sensitivity? That's revising the standard process?
Subject to, yes, if that was what Standards Australia decided to do.
That's fine.
Yes. And then the other element is that the white paper advises that the government will start to require airports to demonstrate consistency with the National Airport Safeguarding Framework in the master planning and major development planning process. That will pick up Guideline A from the National Airport Safeguarding Framework, which requires the depiction or requests the depiction of noise outside what we would traditionally describe as severely impacted. So I think one of the arguments is that we stop the analysis at 20 ANEF. However, it's not the case that the impacts of aircraft noise stop at 20 ANEF, and that hasn't necessarily been depicted in the planning process, but the National Airport Safeguarding Framework, if applied, would cause people to consider beyond the 20 ANEF area, so give consideration to the impact of communities beyond the 20 ANEF through the major development planning process once those regulations have been changed.
Which would in fact increase this sensitivity, because if you're going down to 15 or 10,
Yes.
which was part of the conversation this morning, would have the effect of increasing that sensitivity analysis. Okay.
Thanks, Senator Colbeck. Senator Sterle.
Real quickly, I will, Chair. Thank you, Mr Sharp. Congratulations on your appointment. Sorry if you were at last estimates, because I was lucky I had COVID. So welcome aboard. And as I'd said earlier on, a new broom's coming through and there's a new sheriff in town. So I just want to ask you, did you see the comments from Melbourne Airports, their submission, their recommendations? If you didn't, I'll just help.
I haven't seen their submission, no.
No worries. And I quizzed Melbourne Airports about this earlier. And one of their recommendations is that air services, Melbourne Airport recommends that air services provides greater transparency on any investigations it completes and ensures that public information is updated in a timely manner. What's your comments around that?
Yes, look, it's important. If you look at the principles of consultation, transparency and openness of decision-making as well, these are all areas that Air Services has been improving, and there's still some improvements to make. So we're certainly committed to that. In respect to Melbourne, we've got a couple of stages of consultation coming up, and we'll be rolling all the lessons from Brisbane in particular into the approval that's just been tabled by the Minister. The Minister has made it very clear that the consultation process around Melbourne needs to be at a higher level, and we certainly acknowledge that. So I'm not surprised at the comments, but we're committing to roll those lessons forward, and the current frameworks that have been developed over the last year or two would be applied.
That's great. Thanks, Mr Sharp. And I'm not going to let you comment, Mr Curran, because you've been let off a leash and you're full of beans at the moment, so we've got to move on. That's a compliment.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, the chair's gone. Right, let's go. It's adjournment.
I think we moved to...
Okay, I'll try
Sydney
it anyway.
Airport, is it?
All right, well, thank you very much. Now, no one else, so I can safely say that we will now move to Western Sydney's airport.